There is a specific kind of cruelty reserved for those who outlive their own era. In the iron-cold history of the Seven Kingdoms, no name carries the weight of shattered ideals quite like Barristan Selmy. He is the living shadow of the age of heroes, a man whose soul was forged in the White Sword Tower, and whose identity was stitched into the very silk of his white cloak. To the world, he was a monument, a statue of chivalry, standing guard at the foot of the Iron Throne. But monuments are meant to be silent. They are meant to endure the weathering of seasons without complaint. In the year of the great turnover, the boy king Joffrey Baratheon looked upon this monument and saw only an obstacle. He saw a rusted shield that needed to be discarded, a relic that had survived its usefulness. They offered him a pension. They offered him a keep in the Stormlands. They offered him the hollow comfort of a toothless old age. They expected the old man to go quietly into the night. They were wrong, because Barristan the Bold did not just serve the crown. He guarded the light, and when the light was extinguished by the greed of lions, he chose the uncertainty of the storm over the indignity of the cage. The dismissal of Barristan Selmy was not a mere change in personnel. It was a theological assassination. The Kingsguard is built on the foundation of forever. It is a vow that ends only when the heart stops beating. When Joffrey commanded Barristan to remove his cloak, he was not just firing a soldier. He was unraveling a sacred tapestry of 300 years. He replaced a legend with a kingslayer and a hound, signaling to the world that in the Lannister regime, loyalty is a commodity, and honor is a liability. For Barristan, this was the ultimate betrayal of the institution he had bled for. He had stood by while the Mad King burned the innocent. He had kept his silence while the trident ran red with the blood of princes. He had traded his conscience for his oath, thinking that the oath itself was the highest form of virtue. And then, in a single moment of petulant arrogance, the crown declared that his sacrifice was worthless. The pension they offered was not a reward. It was a bribe to stay silent. It was a price tag on his dignity. They wanted him to retire to a windowless hall, to grow fat on the memory of his former self, while the corruption of the capital rotted the realm to its core. But a true knight cannot be retired. He can only be martyred or reborn as he cast his sword at the foot of the throne. He didn't just walk out of a room. He walked out of a century of servitude. He reclaimed his agency from a dynasty that no longer deserved his protection. The old man was gone. The bold was back. To Tywin Lannister, power was something you hoarded in a vault. To Joffrey, it was a toy to be broken. They thought everyone had a price. They offered Barristan a keep. They offered him lands, servants, and a comfortable bed in the Stormlands. They thought they were giving him a reward for a lifetime of service, but they fundamentally misunderstood the man behind the white plate. Barristan Selmy had spent decades in the windowless cells of the White Sword Tower. He had intentionally stripped himself of the burdens of lordship. For him, a knight is a flame, pure, focused, and unburdened by the weight of soil. To give him a keep was to shackle him to the earth. It was an attempt to turn a living legend into a domestic relic. A man who had guarded the secrets of 2 dynasties did not want to spend his final days counting bags of grain or settling border disputes between peasants. He saw the offer for what it truly was, a golden cage designed to keep him quiet while the realm burned. By rejecting the gift, Barristan reclaimed his agency. He realized that his true home was not a castle, but the edge of his blade. For years, Barristan was a man haunted by the ghosts of his own silence. He had served Aerys the Mad, watching as the king turned men into ash. He had served Robert the Usurper, watching as the king turned a reign into a drunken stupor. He carried the weight of Summerhall, the tragedy that birthed a generation of guilt. He carried the scars of the Trident, where he fought for a prince he loved against a rebel who would become his master. He had lived his life by the letter of the law, but in the process he had nearly lost the spirit of justice. The moment he walked out of the throne room in King's Landing, the chains of his old oaths finally snapped. He was no longer a servant of the Iron Throne. He was a knight errant in search of a cause worth dying for. He didn't just want a king, he wanted a true king. He wanted a legacy that didn't taste like ash and regret. His survival instinct shifted. It was no longer about keeping his heart beating, it was about ensuring that when his heart finally stopped, it would be for something that mattered. He looked across the narrow sea, not to escape, but to find redemption for the sins of the past 40 years. He was an old man starting a new war, not for power, but for the chance to look in a mirror and see a knight instead of a shadow. A man who spent 50 years as the most recognizable face of chivalry had to learn the art of disappearing. The transition from Barristan the Bold to Arstan Whitebeard was more than a strategic disguise. It was a spiritual shedding of skin. He walked the dusty roads of Essos, clutching a wooden staff instead of a Valyrian blade. He traded the silk of a palace for the grime of the caravan. Why the deception? Because Barristan understood that a knight's greatest weapon is not his steel, but his judgment. He did not want to join Daenerys Targaryen as a sycophant or a desperate exile. He wanted to observe her from the shadows, to see if the blood of the dragon had finally produced a queen worthy of the sword he still carried in his heart. This was a man haunted by the failure of the father. He had watched Aerys descend into madness, and he felt the crushing weight of every innocent scream he had failed to silence. As he watched Daenerys, he wasn't just looking for a ruler. He was looking for a daughter he could save, a legacy he could protect without losing his soul. The mask of Arstan allowed him to be a student of history again. He saw the cruelty of the slave masters and the chaotic hope of the freedmen. He realized that honor is not a static thing you keep in a tower. It is a living, breathing choice you make in the mud of the real world. When he finally revealed his true identity, it wasn't an act of pride. It was an act of surrender. He surrendered his anonymity to a woman he believed could heal the wounds of the realm. In that moment, the old man died, and the White Knight of the East was born. He proved that even in exile, even in disguise, the gravity of a true knight remains unshakable. Westeros, in the twilight of the dragons, is a landscape of compromised men. We see Jaime Lannister struggling to find a path through the debris of his own infamy. We see Jorah Mormont, a man defined by the hunger for a love he can never truly earn. But Barristan Selmy stands apart. He is not seeking to fix a broken reputation. He is seeking to fulfill a destiny that was interrupted by the incompetence of kings. His refusal to retire was the final, definitive act of the Age of Heroes. In a world where honor had become a punchline for people like Littlefinger and Varys, Barristan treated it as a physical constant, as unyielding as gravity. He proved that chivalry is not a title granted by a crown, but a choice made in the silence of one's own conscience. When he stood in the fighting pits of Meereen, or when he commanded the defense of a city that was not his own, he wasn't fighting for a throne. He was fighting for the idea that a promise still matters. As we look back at the cinematic and literary journey of this character, we realize that Barristan was the last bridge to a vanished world. A world where the white cloak actually meant something, where a knight was a shield for the weak, rather than a blunt instrument for the powerful. He chose the uncertainty of the East, the heat of the desert, and the blood of a new war over the quiet, dishonorable death they tried to sell him in the Stormlands. He taught us that it is better to die on your feet, clutching a sword in a foreign land, than to live on your knees in a palace built on lies. He didn't just survive, he remained. And in the end, that is the greatest victory a knight can achieve. To remain himself when the rest of the world has forgotten what that even means. When we finally look at the tapestry of Barristan Selmy's life, we see a pattern that logic cannot explain, but honor demands. He is the man who outlived his kings, outfought his peers, and ultimately outshone the corruption of his age. His journey from the White Sword Tower to the red sands of Meereen is the ultimate rebuttal to the cynicism of the world. It proves that even when the institution fails, the individual can remain sacred. The white cloak was taken from him, but they could never take the white from his soul. By choosing the uncertainty of exile over the comfort of a hollow retirement, Barristan turned his twilight years into his most radiant sunrise. He didn't just find a new queen, he found his own voice, liberated from the silent servitude that had defined him for 50 years. To us, watching from the vantage point, Barristan stands as a reminder. He reminds us that our value is not determined by the title on our door or the pension in our bank account. It is determined by the weight of our word and the courage to walk away from a table where honor is no longer served. He was the last of the great knights, not because he was the strongest, but because he was the most unyielding. In the great game, most players are just moving pieces of wood and bone, but Barristan was the board itself, steady, enduring, and etched with the scars of 1,000 battles. As we close the book on Barristan the Bold, we don't mourn a retired soldier. We celebrate a flame that refused to be snuffed out. Because as long as one man remembers what it means to be a knight, the age of heroes never truly ends. He didn't go quietly into the night. He walked into the sun, sword in hand, forever bold.